All right, and I also want to acknowledge Michael at the back who's helping us with everything. Michael, is it going to mess things up if we just get ahead of the schedule in terms of this green light, red light? We'll just go. All right. Right, and also in the interest of keeping on schedule, we will keep the introductions fairly brief for the keynote speakers. So I'll model that right now. Our first speaker in our first theme, Threats and Challenges, is Chris Field. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He's the McCarthy Director of the Stanford Woods Institute at Stanford University. And the title of his presentation is Managing Forests for Carbon and Co-Benefits. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Janet. Thanks, everybody, for participating in what looks like it's going to be a really exciting session. And thank you, Yadvinder, for your role in organizing. It's fun for me to start the discussion about threats and challenges, but those of you who know me know that I'm an incurable optimist, and there's no way that I can only look at the problem side of an issue. And so what I'd like to do is highlight where we are in the climate challenge and how ecosystems are positioned, but open a doorway to where I hope we can be headed in terms of developing a solution space. And in order to do that, I'm going to talk about 4 themes. The first is, in the context of climate, acknowledging that we're doing lots of things, incredibly helpful, but that we're not doing them nearly fast enough. So the climate challenge is really about finding an accelerator pedal on action rather than transitioning from doing nothing to doing something. Because we're here focused on ecosystems, we have a tremendous opportunity to ask how ecosystems can participate in the development of climate solutions. And I think that the real opportunity that I hope we'll explore here is figuring out what the quantitative opportunity is and what kind of policies need to be put in place in order to enable the maximum possible expression of natural climate solutions. The big challenge, of course, is that ecosystems participate in climate in many ways as sources of greenhouse gases as well as sinks. And we really have a wide series of challenges in managing the negative implications of ecosystem processes as well as taking advantage of the positive ones. And the closing thoughts that I want to provide are in the context of how we recognize that solving the climate challenge isn't going to work unless we're simultaneously recognizing other aspects of building economies, building communities, identifying pathways to sustainability that allow us to think comprehensively about a solution set. I'm sure everybody's aware of the fact that climate change is real, and the IPCC Era 5, the conclusion was that warming is unequivocal, and it's extremely likely that humans are the dominant cause of the warming since the middle of the last century. One of the things that's striking to me when you look at this NOAA plot of the combined global and the land and ocean temperature anomalies is that the warmest year on the record, which is 2016, is about 1.35 above the pre-industrial average. And as you know, the most recent IPCC report talks about the climate damages we can anticipate at a temperature level of about 1.5 above pre-industrial. You look at this chart and see that we've been warming at about 0.2 per decade, and I know you guys are good at math. So let's think about the implications of where we are in terms of the dynamic of warming. And one of the frustrating observations of recent years, but that makes it much easier to understand the implications, is that warming from carbon dioxide essentially permanent. It persists in the climate system for thousands of years. And what that means is that there's a lifetime budget for CO2 emissions. And from the first ton of carbon that was released at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution until the last ounce that's released by humanity, that's going to control the amount of warming in the system. And once we've used up that lifetime budget, we're over the whatever warming target. And I'm going to run through an example here for the 1.5. This is from the most recent IPCC report, but it We could do a similar exercise if our target was the UNFCCC's well below 2, or even if it was higher than that. So the lifetime budget, forever, when the last ounce of CO2 is emitted to the atmosphere for a greater than 66% probability of stabilizing warming below 1.5, is a little bit shy of 2,800 billion tons of CO2 forever. There's an opportunity for a rich discussion of whether the probability of whatever target we pick should be much higher than 66%. And I would argue that it should be. But the emissions through 2017 are a little north of 2,200 billion tons of CO2. I know you guys are good at arithmetic. The remaining forever budget is around 550 billion tons of CO2 for this 66% chance of stabilizing warming at less than 1.5 above pre-industrial. In 2017, the emissions were 41.7 billion tons of CO2 based on the work of the Global Carbon Project. And you can divide that number into the 550 and come up with how long it would be until we're committed to that 1.5 C if emissions continued at the 2017 rate. Of course, historically, emissions have still been increasing, and we haven't yet turned a corner even to stabilizing. But the date you should put on your calendar is March of 2031 for commitment to at least 1.5 C. And I would argue that more than anything else is the primary motivation for finding this accelerator pedal on dealing with climate change. That it's not that we don't know what the solutions look like, and it's not that we aren't deploying some, it's that the time that's available for responding is so short, and the pace of action is so inconsistent with that. We often underestimate the importance of ecosystems in the current carbon budget. And this slide from the Global Carbon Project highlights two important components. One is the role of human manipulation of ecosystems and driving current sources of CO2. And 12% of emissions in the last decade were a result of deforestation, mainly in the tropics. But a very large fraction of the sinks, 30% of the fate of the carbon that was emitted to the atmosphere, ended up in ecosystems on land. Another 23% ended up in the oceans. And when we think about managing ecosystems in the future, huge opportunity is in decreasing the contribution to emissions and preventing a decrease in the amount that's in carbon sinks and if possible, increasing that. That comes into particularly sharp focus when we look at the proposals for bringing emissions down to zero. And I'll take this example from Anderson and Peters as a possible trajectory, and the aspect of the trajectory that I want to highlight is that the global net CO2 emissions transition, there the black line in the on the time scale, transition from being a positive to the atmosphere, net emissions, to negative to the atmosphere sometime in the early part of the second half of the 21st century. And at least in this simulation and in most of the model calculations, the end of the century is one where emissions are net negative at quite a large number. The average across the integrated assessment models in the IPCC AR5 was about 12 billion tons of CO2 per year, and that was 12 billion tons net in the context of a global economy that's still releasing some CO2 to the atmosphere. So the actual negative emissions, removal of CO2 to the atmosphere and sequestration in some kind of a storage pool, was typically more than 15 billion tons of CO2 per year. And the potential pools for those negative emissions to go into are geological formations under the ground, but also ecosystems on land and storage in the oceans. And when we talk about natural climate solutions, the question is, well, how much could we take advantage of natural processes in order to contribute to these negative emissions? And the answer is that potentially it's a really big number. Here's an example from a paper last year by Bronson Griscom et al. That asks how much could we sequester in forests if we did a better job of managing them. And the answer is that the maximum looks like it could be larger than 10 billion tons of CO2 per year in the open bars at a reasonable CO2 price, more around the order of $100 a ton of CO2. The sequestration potential in this analysis is on the order of 6 billion tons per year, contributing almost half of what we need in net negative emissions. And even at a very cheap carbon price of $10 a ton, the estimate is that there's the potential for ecosystems to do a net benefit to the climate of about 2 billion tons of CO2 per year. Now some of these are in the space of decreasing emissions, and some are in the space of increasing negative emissions. And whether or not these numbers are exactly right, there's a tremendous potential to utilize ecosystems as part of the solution and not simply as a part of the problem. And one of the interesting ideas that's introduced in this analysis by Griscom et al. Is that each of these steps is associated with potentially compelling range of other benefits. They highlight air quality, biodiversity, water quality, and soil health. And I think if we're able to take advantage of many of these natural climate solutions, the real question is going to be, to what extent can we connect the climate benefits with these co-benefits? On the other hand, we know this photograph of one of the devastating wildfires in California in 2016, that the ecosystems can also transition from contributing to climate solutions to making the problem more challenging, and climate change definitely exacerbates the issue with processes like increasing wildfires in the western U.S. really contributing to the net transformation of ecosystems from carbon sinks to carbon sources. On the other hand, there are a wide range of opportunities for building synergies between improving forest health, improving forest carbon sinks, and a whole range of other activities that not only support natural processes, but can support human economies and human communities. So what I want to do in closing is begin outlining a pathway to capitalizing on the potential to mobilize some of these co-benefits. And the first and kind of most important component is that, you know, we tend to operate in a regulatory environment where we say, well, okay, it would be fine to provide credit for ecosystem sinks, but only if there was no other motivation. If we can be sure that those sinks are additional and they would not have been created as a consequence of interest in doing something else. I think that's the least likely pathway to be successful, and what we really need to do if we're going to drive a renaissance in incorporating natural climate solutions into a broad portfolio is to rethink the concept of additionality and focus on investing in places where there was a powerful motivation for action already, and where the climate motivation provides the nudge that takes us over the top of the hill. The real challenge is to make the sum of the actions, or to make the total consequence of the actions more than the sum of the parts. That's my 1 + 1 = 3 is the way we need to get outcomes of ecosystem management additionality. The second thing we need to do is recognize, and you know, maybe in the spirit of speaking to the threats and challenges, the biggest one is that ecosystem management is incredibly fractionated and is distributed among in any jurisdiction, dozens of agencies. And when we talk about effectively managing ecosystems in the future, we really need to find a way for the diverse actors in the government space, the civil society space, in the commercial space, to find ways to act together. And I think the recent elections in the U.S. are an indication of how challenging that is, and how moving forward, we have a ton of challenges in thinking about the ecosystem processes, but an even bigger range of challenges in thinking how to bring the human dimensions of the problem together, and recognizing that we're not really going to be able to capitalize on these co-benefits until we can implement the roles of each of the kind of actors that needs to play a space. The third thing that really needs to happen is that when we talk about providing natural climate solutions in the context of a wide range of benefits, we typically don't have a mechanism for evaluating the benefits that are being achieved outside the climate space. You know, there's a big discussion that's been ongoing for decades about whether we need to convert ecosystem services into monetary terms. And I'd argue that we don't need to do that, but what we do need to do is to find a way to recognize that real values are being provided, and that unless those values are capitalized on, we're not going to be able to find the kind of acceleration that's truly necessary. And then the final thing that needs to happen is we need to recognize that a truly coordinated and impactful approach to ecosystem management isn't going to occur in a slipshod manner. And we need to recognize that our responsibility is to build the kind of coalitions that can plan effectively, and that effective planning needs to occur at the community level. It needs to occur at the subnational jurisdiction level, at the private sector level, at the government level, and in the context of international organizations. And until we're really ready to put the pieces in place to execute on plans, the threats and challenges are going to proceed more rapidly than the opportunities and solutions. But I'm optimistic that the essential features and the added benefits of thinking comprehensively about the value of ecosystem management really does open the pathway to solutions. And I hope that this spirit of optimism can really flower during the conversations we have here, and that all of you are going to light the way to genuine implementation. So thanks very much. I look forward to your comments. And should I just do questions myself, or how?
We have 10 minutes. So,
okay.
Please use your microphone when you're asking questions.
Be happy to take thoughts, questions, critiques. Yeah, count.
Here we go. Sorry. That's all very interesting, and I've faced the same sort of challenges in the marine environment, thinking about ways in which marine ecosystems can be used in ways that will provide co-benefits to communities as well as to climate change. But the big piece that you left out of your presentation is the kind of pushback from the fossil fuel industry, which, if these solutions are going to be implemented rapidly, then there needs to be some sort of shift in that sector, so that there's more willingness to cut their business opportunities and diversify into other forms of economic activity. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, we could have or I hope we do have an incredibly rich discussion about what are the enablers that would potentially allow the barriers to be removed, or particularly the private companies in the oil and gas space, especially, to transition from being opponents of action to being proponents. A frustrating feature of where we are currently is that most of the oil and gas majors say they're advocates for a carbon tax. They are working actively in the space of carbon capture and storage, but their role in the policy environment has tended to be the opposite. In Tuesday's election in Washington, the proposal for a carbon fee in the state of Washington was defeated by voters, and there had been a huge influx of fossil fuel company money into opposing that campaign, even though the funding was coming from the same companies that say they favor a carbon tax. So there's an irony there, and I'm not an expert in the politics, and I won't speak to that. But when I look at the space of co-benefits, it's really clear that there are opportunities for creative forces within the private sector community to be successful in an environment of climate change. In fact, I think it's really clear that building a 21st century energy system is probably the biggest economic opportunity that we look forward to. And so the real question is how to manage the transition from one of foot dragging to one of enthusiastic advocacy. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I hope that people have thoughtful ideas, and I'm going to definitely write down any that I hear during the conversations moving forward. Yeah, Sandra.
I was very interested in the point of rethinking additionality. I would like you to elaborate a little bit more and maybe give an example of what you mean, because I think it's a really important thing there.
Yeah, well, in the space of accounting for carbon sinks, there's a very legitimate concern that one wouldn't want to give a landowner, for example, credit for protecting a forest if that landowner had already decided for some other reason to protect the forest. And, a good example is if you'd already received a payment from a water bond to protect a forest for watershed conservation, there's something that would be arguably unfair about receiving an additional sum of money for the amount of carbon that was sequestered. My sense is that if you look at ecosystems around the world, there are compelling motivations to improve conservation, to increase carbon stocks, but in most cases those haven't quite reached the threshold of moving people from thinking it's a good idea to action. And the problem we face in the motivation for conservation space is that unless you can combine these motivations into some kind of a package, and we never reach the threshold. And I think that the primary motivation for rethinking additionality is finding a way to allow multiple motivations to actually interact in a positive way rather than what I would argue now is a negative way. Yeah, Dan.
I'm less familiar with the US governmental system than with the UK system, but in the UK there's a wide number of different agencies involved in dealing with ecological implications. So for example, if you take a system like the coastal system, it's, the river is managed by one governmental agency, the coast by another, landowners. So it's a breakdown in who's responsible for initiating change, who's responsible for planning, who's responsible for bringing those people together. What's your view on how we can facilitate that these debates are happening and so that the people in charge of those processes see the need for interaction?
Well, that's why I'm on the threats and challenges side of the discussion rather than the solutions. I don't know. I mean, it's a really, really good question. I believe that the biggest challenge we face is bringing the different stakeholders together, and there are lots of compelling things that are happening, especially in the civil society. My little lapel pin here says "We're still in." It's about the U.S. entities that are committed to meeting the requirements of the Paris Agreement for the United States. And there's lots of exciting work that's happening outside of governments, but it's hard for me to see how things really get stitched together until governments are willing to be much more deeply engaged and to recognize that this is fundamentally a challenge of bringing different kinds of entities together. And honestly, I don't know any governments that are doing it right, and I think our big challenge is to really advocate for that. Kate.
So to sort of flip that question on its head, given that there are all these things that we probably need to do if we want to make a difference, and yet you're talking to a room full of researchers, what are the implications for the kind of research we should be doing or the questions that we should be asking that are going to facilitate making this happen, even if we're not the people who are going to bring the players together?
Really, really good question. And one of the things I'm going to be interested in the conversations moving forward is the extent to which this sort of multi-objective thinking about ecosystems is really mature and ready for prime time. It's a hard concept. I would say that outside our community, very few people understand it and understand its potential. And I'm optimistic that the products of this discussion will contribute to setting a research agenda that really allows people to explore the implications of a multi-objective management and also to make it understandable to a general public. 2 minutes and 25 seconds left, yeah.
Of the 4 points you have on the co-benefits, I was wondering which one or ones you thought would require a step change. You started talking about acceleration. Where for you is there really the greatest challenge for acceleration?
What's the most important element of acceleration? The first question was about the role of opposition to action in addressing the environment, and I think the real question is whether the steps forward are going to be ones that are grounded in confrontation or in finding a way to build coalitions where we can increase the fraction of the community, the fraction of the economic resources, and the fraction of the institutional resources that are all headed in the same direction. And at least for me, I think that the most important enablers would be ones that allowed economic enterprises, private sector enterprises, to obtain value, creating investment opportunities for improving ecosystems. And right now, the incentives all tend to be in the direction of destroying ecosystems rather than protecting them. What would that require? I don't think it can happen within the NGO community. I don't think it can happen with any government alone. But I think that we're seeing seeds get planted, and things like the willingness of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway to contribute to forest conservation is really important. California has now started a forest carbon offset program that's a really nice experiment, and has proposed moving that to the tropics. So we're seeing lots of little seeds. What we really need to do is experiment and see what works and what doesn't. Okay, 6 seconds left. I guess we'll have one super quick question. Tim.
Take me 6 seconds to switch this on, Chris. My simple question was
not
actually
enough time to be critical, I should say.
Well, it's going to be whether you are picturing us just putting a marketable value on these different ecosystem services. And my caveat to that was going to be that they're not all substitutable in economists' language. And good economists have recognized this, and that unsubstitutability of losing biodiversity actually gives it a greater, or it should give it a greater value in what economists would do as a cost-benefit analysis. Because in simple terms, nature, the ecosystem isn't growing in the way the economy is, so it gets this relative scarcity value the more you go into the future. And that if we could somehow bring that sort of insight into this, that element of unsubstitutability, we would actually effectively, in our decision making, value it even more than whatever price we might derive from it.
It's a really important point, and I hope I sufficiently emphasize that I don't think converting ecosystem services into monetary terms is the right approach. I think that there's a legitimate, huge diversity of valuations that need to be brought to the table, and for some parts of the society, protection of the pathways for indigenous communities is overwhelmingly important. For others, protection of biodiversity is overwhelmingly important. And as you say, the non-substitutability will lead to a huge amplification of value for some people and not for others. And I think that we can move forward in a way that embraces that diversity of perspectives, but still recognizes that there are values there that need to be accounted. Thanks very much for a great set of questions.